Good morning again. Today we're going to look at John 7, verse 28 through chapter 8, verse 11, I think. Yeah, 11. That'll incorporate part of tomorrow's reading, John 1 through 17 or 20, whatever it's supposed to be, and then I'll finish that part of the rest of the rest of tomorrow's on Monday. And I'm going to do that for kind of two reasons. Now, the first reason is that, today it says we should read through verse 53 of chapter 7, which is the last verse, but in a lot of manuscripts it's not there. And that verse and chapter 8, verse 1 through 11 are in italics in this Bible that I have, and they're not in a couple of Bibles that I have. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But as we begin our reading today, Jesus is in the temple. People have been saying, we don't know who he is, we don't know where he's from, and all of these things, and they don't know where the Messiah is supposed to show up. And Jesus, it says, cries out with a loud voice as he was teaching, "You know me and you know where I'm from. I haven't come to you on my own." And I probably kind of downplayed that I haven't come to you on my own. I mean, Jesus is on a mission from God, and he isn't there, patting himself on the back, beating his own drum or any of that stuff. He is there because of God. He says, "I have not come on my own, but the one who sent me is true. And you don't know him, but I know him because I am from him." And then, he's talking about equality with God. And it says, then they tried to arrest him, but no one could lay hands on him. And then John uses those words, because his hour had not yet come. We see those words in the Gospels every once in a while. People will say that, Jesus got to the cross Jesus going to the cross wasn't God's original plan of Jesus coming into the world. And maybe in creation it wasn't, but by the time Jesus came, I truly believe that it was. Because in the conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus back in chapter 3, very early on, he said, the Son of Man must be lifted up. So he knew, Jesus knew, but yet his hour wasn't here yet. And sometimes his hour not coming yet was, to his mother, he said that at the wedding of Cana, that, maybe it's not really quite time, but, it happened. But it wasn't time for the crucifixion yet. And John points that out to us. And, the guards couldn't arrest Jesus. I mean, whether it was because he kind of disappeared into the midst or he had been there kind of secretly for the first half of this festival of booths and then began to teach in the temple. But it says in verse 31, yet many in the crowd believed in him and were saying and wondering, well, when Messiah comes, can he do more than this man does? So they were saying, how can this man not be the Messiah with everything he's doing? How could the Messiah do any more than what Jesus is doing? Kind of the reverse argument, maybe a little bit, of Jesus is the Messiah, But the Pharisees heard the crowds muttering such things and sent the temple police to arrest him, it says. And Jesus then said, I will be with you a little while longer, and then I'm going to the one who sent me. So even though the temple police come to arrest Jesus, he isn't concerned by that. He knows that he's going to be with the people a little while longer. This festival of booths where Jesus is now is the 7th month, the Passover, 12th month. So he's got, about 5 months or so, left here before he will be journeying to Jerusalem for that final encounter with everyone. And the religious leaders and stuff, Jesus says, where I'm going you cannot come, and you do not know. And, it's a puzzle to them because, well, where can Jesus go that we won't be able to find him or that we won't know? Is he going to go off somewhere with the Gentiles? Or, it was, his words didn't make sense because they wouldn't understand maybe, that Jesus was talking about returning to the Father, because they couldn't accept that Jesus had come from the Father, that Jesus is the Messiah. that as he lived on this earth, he was the living Messiah. They couldn't come to that. And then in verse 37, it says, on the last day of the festival, Jesus was standing there, and he said, let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes drink. Out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of the living water. And he was talking about the Holy Spirit. And tomorrow is Pentecost Sunday, the day of fire and speaking in tongues and all. And it's the day that we are encouraged by many churches to wear red, signifying the Holy Spirit and the coming of that power. But Jesus is talking here about the Spirit that will come. And tomorrow's reading from Acts is Luke's version of the Holy Spirit being poured out upon the disciples. And we read that every year on Pentecost. But here Jesus is talking about the Spirit coming. And it says, for as yet there was no Spirit because Jesus hadn't been glorified. He tells his disciples that I will send a helper, I will send a paraclete, I will send the advocate, I will send the Holy Spirit, and it will become upon you. And so they haven't received that Spirit that freely flows yet from Jesus that way. And as people were listening to Jesus on this final day at the temple, at the festival of booths rather, many were proclaiming, this is the Messiah, this is the prophet. But then there were others that said, but it can't be the Messiah because he's from Galilee. And he's got to come from Bethlehem. He's got to be of the city of David. Because they didn't know, they weren't aware that Jesus had been born in Bethlehem. That Jesus was indeed, the descendant of David that way. They didn't know all of those facts yet. And so for them to figure out that Jesus had, lived in Nazareth. He was born in Bethlehem, and then when the king was going to destroy all of the babies 2 years old and less, Joseph and Mary and Jesus moved to Egypt for a time until that king was dead, and then God said to come back, and they settled in this obscure village of Nazareth to be anonymous. That's why Joseph and Mary lived way out there. That's why Jesus was raised there, to stay out of the eye of the Roman authorities. So for these Jewish people who knew the prophecies that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem and a descendant of David, that Jesus was from Galilee, lived in Nazareth, was just not right. And it's like Nathanael said when Philip came to him and said, we have found the Messiah. He is Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael's response, can anything good come from Nazareth? Well, yeah, it does, But so it was, questions and wonderings, and some people convinced and others just on the border and some absolutely not, and that's the way it is today, no different. Verse 45 is interesting. It says, then the temple police went back to the chief priests and Pharisees, and they asked them, well, why didn't you arrest him? Have you come under the same delusion from him, having listened to him? Why didn't you arrest him when you had the chance? That was their job. They were sent to arrest Jesus, and they didn't do it. And, but, they didn't really get an answer that way. But in verse 50, Nicodemus, it says, Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus before and was one of them, says, our law does not judge people without first giving them a hearing to find out what they're doing, does it? So Nicodemus is standing up for Jesus. Nicodemus has thought, I think, long and hard about his conversation with Jesus. And at the end of John's gospel, as I've said, and we'll get there, Nicodemus comes with Joseph of Arimathea to lay Jesus in the tomb. But these Pharisees and others, when Nicodemus says that, they look at him and say, well, surely you're not from Galilee also, are you? Search, and you'll find that there is never a prophet that has come from Galilee. And then the verse 53 that's not in all the texts, then each of them went home. And verses 1 through 11 of chapter 8 Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, comes again early in the morning to the temple. And while he's in the temple, the people came and he was teaching them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought this woman who had been caught in adultery and made her stand in front of all of them. Public trial, public shaming. But they come to Jesus and say, teacher. You mean teacher? They give him that recognition. They give him that honor. And they say this woman was caught committing adultery. Now the law of Moses says we must stone her to death. What do you say? You know? Well, why would Jesus argue with the law of Moses? However, you know this story, I'm sure you do. He turns the table on him. And, you know, it says it to test him. And it says that Jesus simply bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. They kept on questioning him, and he stood up and he said this, let anyone among you who is without sin cast the first stone. And then he bent down again and started writing on the ground with his finger. And what he wrote has no bearing on anything. He could have been scribbling the, and, to, but, for. He could have been scribbling anything. Or he could have been writing out sins of others. Who knows? But it doesn't matter. But when Jesus said to them, it says, they went away, beginning with the elders. Beginning with the elders. That is important. The elders, the leaders, the respected ones, the ones whose words carry more sway, more weight than anyone else. These elders thought about Jesus' words, and they realized that they were not without sin. And since they were not without sin, they had no right then to judge this woman, to cast that first stone. So the elders went away first. And when Jesus looked up again, there was just himself and this woman. And he looked and he says, where have your accusers gone? They have all left. He says, has no one condemned you? And she says, no one, sir. And he says, neither do I then condemn you. Go and sin no more. And that neither have I condemned you goes back to John 3:16. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world would be saved through him. So Jesus did not condemn this woman. And it's another question that comes up to me. They caught the woman in adultery. There must have been a man involved. Why didn't they bring him too? Because it should have been same punishment for him, shouldn't it? I don't know, but fair is fair, right? If you're guilty, if one person's guilty of the same crime as the other, they should be guilty, or they should be subjected to the same punishment. But Jesus looks on this woman with love and grants her forgiveness, grants her a second chance. And that's God. God is the God of second chances, third chances, mulligans, do-overs. He did not come. He did not send Jesus to condemn, but rather to save. So may you live today surrounded by the love of God.